Chapter 14. Janet. Richard didn't call the Luthier the next morning. He decided that he needed to talk with him face to face to apologize properly. His only hope was that he could smooth things out without making a scene. He wondered if the Luthier would still make him a violin, especially if the money meant nothing to him, like the officer had said. "I'll just have to risk it," Richard assured himself while driving north on the freeway. Richard parked next to a white rental car in front of the violin shop. White again, he marveled. After glancing up at the hot desert sun, he realized why. Another customer, he surmised. This could be awkward. Richard considered returning when he could be alone with the Luthier, but then thought about Christopher, the young Asian boy from the day before, and his curiosity got the best of him. What different kinds of people buy his instruments, he wondered. Richard shuddered. What if they're here to place an order? Panic seized Richard as his gaze shifted toward the top of the violin shop. The luthier had mentioned that the customer lived in Japan and would make a special trip after he was called. If someone orders an instrument now, it could be 3 more months. The dealer in New York would never be willing to hold the Guarnerius that long. What could he do? What would he say? "Please, I know I'm the one who swore at you yesterday, but can you make these people wait so you can make my violin first?" Richard sank back in the seat, regretting that he had lost his temper the day before. Yet the luthier deserved it, Richard assured himself. While studying the serpents' heads and the large stone stairs, Richard tried being optimistic. Even if someone is taking my slot, I might as well see who it is. Deep down inside, not willing to admit it to himself yet, Richard was dying of curiosity. There was no music when Richard paused in the shade outside the door. "Here we go," he told himself while turning the handle. The luthier was wearing a black suit, white shirt, and polished black shoes. His attire was formal, yet everything was still homespun, just like the day before. He was in the process of handing a large red cello to a small, frail woman in her 50s when Richard stepped inside. To Richard, the woman appeared withered and withdrawn. Her hair was wrapped in a tight bun. Her wire-rimmed glasses teetered precariously on her pointed nose, and she wore a dress in the latest fashion. That is, if the year had happened to have been 1932. She reminded Richard of an old-school librarian in junior high, only her scowl wasn't quite so severe. The luthier silently motioned Richard toward the workshop area. It seemed a strange request, since the lights were all off in the back and there were plenty of comfortable chairs in the entry. But since Richard was there to apologize, he decided not to argue. He graciously placed his case on the table and walked back into the darkness. As Richard passed the lady, she appeared intimidated by his presence, even though she didn't seem to recognize who he was. "I believe the adjustments are complete, Miss Gill," announced the luthier while motioning her toward the cello chair. The luthier's smile was warm and sincere, yet the woman still seemed too frightened to move. She began shaking, and Richard wondered if she was going to drop the cello. "It's all right, Janet," the luthier consoled her. "He plays the violin." The luthier acted as if this statement alone should calm all of her fears and explain everything. Interestingly enough, it did. The luthier sat on one of the chairs in the entry and closed his eyes while Janet placed the cello on a stand. When she removed her glasses and placed them on the table, her eyes were shallow and small, her face wrinkled and as white as chalk. Richard tried looking away, yet couldn't help watching her every move. As Janet sat down, she removed 2 long pins from her hair, and with a flowing shake of her head, long, hidden tresses tumbled across her shoulders and over the back of the chair. After taking in a deep breath, she began unfastening the buttons of her blouse. Richard swallowed hard, yet relaxed when she stopped a couple inches below her stiff white collar. Janet directly faced the cello and began looking at it with longing and desire. It seemed like an intimate moment to Richard, and he found himself silently moving his chair a little further behind the desk into the shadows. After lifting the cello from its stand, Janet brought it up against her chest and closed her eyes. It was the way she did it that made Richard squirm. When the scroll came to rest against her neck, she giggled, and Richard thought he saw color filling her cheeks. He squinted his eyes and leaned closer. He could swear that all the small wrinkles in her face had disappeared. She looked peaceful and content for that moment, and to Richard, almost beautiful. Janet lifted the bow and held it, hovering above the strings until the weight became unbearable. Boom! Her mouth dropped open as the music bellowed out of the instrument and crashed against the furthest walls of the violin shop. Even the paintings were left swinging back and forth, and it reminded Richard of Mark playing the dark violin in the concert hall. He turned around just to make sure that nothing had appeared in the shadows behind him. Within a few more notes, Richard could tell that Janet was good. Not as talented as Christopher, the young Asian boy, but still very good. She's a lot more passionate, though, Richard thought, and really gets into it. Janet swayed back and forth with the music, and as the tempo increased, so did her movements. Within a few more bars, she was nearly flying off the edge of her seat at the end of each phrase. What an understatement, Richard realized. He rolled his eyes while trying to imagine what words Julia might use to describe a performance like this. Janet seemed to be playing for herself and no one else. She tore furiously into the instrument until perspiration began pouring from her neck and face. Moments later, she swayed back and forth, weeping with the amorous phrases. Halfway through the piece, she opened her eyes and stared out into space as if in a trance, oblivious to everything around her. Then came the cadenza. Boom, 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 one explosive chord after another, each one shaking the violin shop until the tools on the workbenches began bouncing up and down. Richard caught one chisel just before it reached the edge. Janet's fingers tore up the strings as if they were on fire, and her pulse began racing with the music. The flying spiccato notes flew through the air like daggers, and when she reached the final crescendo, she began letting out sharp gasps as her entire body began shaking in convulsions. After the last note was played, Janet fell limp, completely exhausted. Her clothing was in tatters, and she was soaking wet. When the light fixture above her head finally stopped swinging, she opened her eyes and innocently looked around. The luthier sat motionless, with his eyes still closed, and Richard didn't even breathe. Had he just seen what he thought he had? Now I understand, Richard thought. All of the stories of demons possessing the master instruments, and how they would climb into the bodies of those who played upon them, and all the medieval cries of "Tool of the devil," while the clergy and city officials gathered in the town squares to burn some of the finest violins, violas, and cellos that ever existed. If people had played and acted like this back then, I can begin to understand. After straightening her clothing and putting the cello in its case, Janet rolled her hair back into a bun and replaced her glasses. Even with them on, Richard thought that she looked at least 20 years younger than when he first walked in. The luthier opened his eyes and waited for Janet's response. "It will do," she announced in a tone that once again reminded Richard of the old-school librarian. Janet made her way toward the front door with her cello, as if in a hurry, and opened it without saying another word. With the door almost closed behind her, Janet turned toward the luthier and smiled. "Thank you," she offered, then blushed like a teenage girl and quickly disappeared. As the door swung closed, Richard could swear that she really was just a young woman dressed in her grandmother's old clothes. "And now," the luthier announced, "how may I be of service to you, Mr. Gaspar?" It took Richard a moment to recover and collect his thoughts. He smiled, yet still with a hint of fear in his eyes, he asked, "Will I act like that if I buy a violin from you?" "Perhaps," replied the luthier, while turning to put away the tools he had used to adjust the cello. Richard's eyes opened wide while imagining the shocked expression on Julia's face if she ever saw him perform on stage like Janet just had. Richard couldn't decide whether the luthier was serious or not, and when the luthier turned back around, his words were solemn. "You will know that I have succeeded and made the instrument you need when you don't care what you look like when you play upon it." The luthier's eyes sparkled, and the corners of his mouth lifted into a mischievous grin. "So, if you plan on performing in public, please choose wisely." Even though Richard laughed, the words, "the instrument you need," rang in his ears, and it gave him hope. "I'm sorry," Richard apologized while extending his hand. "My name is Richard Gaspar, and I would like to buy a violin."